I mean, the U.S. is one of the leading terrorist states in the world. The guys who are in charge right now were all condemned for terrorism by the World Court, would have been condemned by the Security Council, except that they vetoed the resolution with Britain abstaining, of course. So, you know, these guys can't be conducting a war on terror. That's just out of the question. And we know what they did during the first phase. They did declare a war on terror 20 years ago. And we know what they did. They destroyed Central America. They killed 1.5 million people in Southern Africa. They, you know, go through the list. Okay, so there's no war on terror. There was a terrorist act, September 11th, you know, very unusual, I mean, real historic event. First time in history that the West was attacked, received the kind of attack that it carries out routinely in the rest of the world, which is a historical event. You know, naturally the West is upset. It's only, we're supposed to do it to others. They're not supposed to do it to us. September 11th did change policy, undoubtedly, not just for the U.S., across the board. I mean, every government in the world saw it as an opportunity to intensify their own repression and atrocities of whatever level they were, you know, ranging from Russia and Chechnya to, in the West, imposing more discipline on their populations and so on, every choice in between. And it had big effects. So, for example, take, say, Iraq, going to that. Prior to September 11th, there's a long-standing concern of the U.S., and I'll skip Britain, it's kind of ancillary, of the U.S. on Iraq, and that is it's got the second largest oil reserves in the world. So one way or another, they're going to do something to get it back. That's clear. September 11th gave a pretext. So there's a change in the rhetoric concerning Iraq after September 11th. We now have an excuse to go ahead and do what we're planning. And it kind of stayed like that up until September of this year. In September of this year, Iraq suddenly shifted from something we're going to take care of to an imminent threat to our existence. Okay? So early September, Condoleezza Rice came out with her warning about the next evidence about a nuclear weapon will be a mushroom cloud, presumably in New York, and a big media campaign and by political figures about got to destroy Saddam very quickly this winter, you know, because otherwise we'll all be dead. And it takes a lot of discipline. You got to kind of admire the intellectual classes not to notice that the only people in the world who are afraid of Saddam Hussein are Americans. I mean, everybody hates him, you know, and Iraqis are undoubtedly afraid of him. But outside of Iraq and the United States, nobody's afraid of him. Like not Kuwait, not Iran, you know, not Israel, nobody in Europe. I mean, they hate him, but they're not afraid of him. The United States people are very much afraid. There's no question about it. And the support that you see in polls about the war is very thin. It's based on fear. And it's an old story in the United States. I mean, when my kids were in elementary school 40 years ago, they were literally, this is not an exaggeration, they were taught to hide under desks in case of an atom bomb attack. I'm not kidding. You know. And the country is always in fear of everything. You know, crime, for example. I mean, crime in the United States is roughly like other industrial societies, you know, kind of a little toward the high end of the spectrum, but not off. On the other hand, fear of crime is way beyond other industrial societies. That's why you have 10 times as many people in jail as in comparable countries. It's engendered, you know, it's very consciously engendered. There's good academic studies of it by politicians, by media, and so on. And the country's in constant fear all the time. These guys now in office, remember, they're all almost entirely from the 1980s. They've been through it already, and they know exactly how to play the game. Right through the 1980s, they periodically had a campaign to terrify the population. 20 years ago, it was Libyan hitmen, you know, roaming the streets of Washington and killing our leader and stuff. Then it was, you know, Grenada, Russian air base, happened to be built by the British, but that was not noticed. You know, Russians are putting up an air base and they're going to bomb us from Grenada. The Sandinistas are 2 days marching time from Harlingen, Texas. You probably remember that. National emergency called. The tourism industry in Europe collapsed every couple of years because Americans were afraid to travel to Paris, or because it might be an Arab hiding behind a telephone booth or something or other. And it just went on like that, and the country's in constant fear. So to arouse fear is not that hard. The timing was so obviously for the congressional campaign that even political commentators couldn't miss it. And they're going to need to do it now because they're going to, for domestic political reasons. I mean, they've got the presidential campaign's going to be starting not that far away. It starts the middle of next year, early next year, and they got to have a victory under their belt and on to the next adventure. Otherwise, the population is going to pay attention to what's happening to them, which is a big assault, a major assault on the population, just as they did in the 1980s. They're replaying the record almost exactly. The first thing they did in 1981 was drive the country into a big deficit. This time they did it with a tax cut for the rich and the biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years. You combine those two, you go from a budget surplus to a budget deficit. If you have a deficit, you have to have Alan Greenspan showing up with a long face and talking about fiscal responsibility, which means cutting the already low level of benefits for people, lack of job security. It happens to be an unusually corrupt administration, so it's kind of like an Enron administration. So there's a tremendous amount of profit going into the hands of an unusually corrupt group of gangsters, and you can't really have all this stuff on the front pages, so you got to push it off the front pages. You have to keep people from thinking about it, and there's only one way that anybody ever figured out: frighten them, and they're good at it. That they did it. That's their experience, and they'll keep doing it. So there's domestic political factors have to do with timing. September 11th gave the pretext, and there's a long-term interest, serious interest. So they got to go to war. The only question is how they'll work it out.